The Cold War was a state of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two world superpowers after the Second World War. And it's generally accepted as starting in 1947 when the Truman Doctrine was signed, and this is basically US foreign policy guaranteeing US aid to countries that felt threatened by the Soviet Union. And it's ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Cold War wasn't a military conflict. So it wasn't a hot war, but instead it was just tension. It was a war of propaganda. So not a hot war. It was a war of propaganda. So it was tension between the USA and the USSR, who were the two superpowers in this new bipolar world. The USSR was obviously the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was a union of Russia and 14 other socialist republics established in 1922. So the Cold War was more of an ideological war, capitalism versus communism. We'll go into more detail in that later. We have on blue here with the capitalist nations and the communist nations in red. The Cold War was also an arms race. There was also a space race evident. For instance, the Soviet Union had launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. The Soviets also sent the first person in space, Yuri Gagarin, and this was 4 years later, in 1961. First person in space. So Sputnik was the first artificial satellite. Yuri Gagarin was the first person in space, but the US managed to land the first person on the moon. The US managed to get to the moon in 1969. The Cold War also posed a risk of a nuclear threat. A risk of annihilation. And we have MAD, which stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. And this was basically a US doctrine which basically ensured, let's take a look at this, it ensured reciprocal deterrence. Basically ensured both sides, the US and USSR, would be deterred from using nuclear weapons. Since either side can retaliate. So since either side can retaliate and cause unacceptable damage, it kind of creates stability. Because both sides' nuclear weapons end up deterring each other and cancelling each other out. So it kind of creates stability, this mutually assured destruction. We also have the creation of alliances. Alliances created. For instance, we have NATO, which was formed in 1949, and we also have the Warsaw Pact, formed in 1955. In Winston Churchill's 1946 speech, he states that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. And as we can see here, the Iron Curtain basically separates the capitalist countries with the communist countries controlled by the USSR. And the Iron Curtain goes from the Baltic Sea. It starts up here, and it goes from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic Sea, to the Adriatic Sea. So it basically ends in a city near Italy, called Trieste. So this is the Iron Curtain in more detail over here. So the Iron Curtain divides Europe into two separate areas of political influence, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. Now, the Cold War is often described as a conflict by proxy or a proxy war, which means the two powers, the US and the USSR, never directly engage in battle, but they use other countries to demonstrate their geopolitical tension. For instance, through the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The Korean War was between 1950 and 1953, and the Vietnam War went from 1955 to 1975, so it lasted a lot longer than the Korean War, though Korea is technically still at war today. There was also a lot of propaganda. For instance, the Marshall Plan in 1948 was sold in part as "you too can be like us." This was an instance of propaganda. The Marshall Plan basically is where the US gave $13 billion to Western Europe in order to help bring out a prosperous Europe and stop communism. It's basically just economic aid, $13 billion from the US given to Western Europe, and it was a success. But propaganda is another characteristic of the Cold War. Now, what were some of the limitations of the Cold War? So neither side at any point tried to invade the territory of the other. At no point did any side try to actually intervene in the other side's sphere of influence. Sure, they tried to grab land, but at no point did they actually intervene in the other side's sphere of influence or invade in any way. And the nuclear weapons arsenal on both sides forced both powers, the US and the USSR, to reject war as a possibility, to reject it as an instrument of policy. So neither side could actually really go to war with each other because of this nuclear weapons threat. This follows the mutually assured destruction idea. Both sides will be deterred from attacking each other since they can cause immense havoc onto each other. So let's compare some of the differences between the USA and the USSR. So the US was capitalist. Its business and property was privately owned by individuals. By contrast, the USSR was communist. All industry owned and run by the state. All of the industry was actually owned and run by the state. Huge difference there. The US was a democracy, which meant its government was chosen in free and democratic elections. By contrast, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was a one-party dictatorship. There were elections, but all the candidates belonged to the Communist Party. The US was the world's wealthiest country, but economic extremes within its people existed. For instance, there were people who were really wealthy and people who were really, really poor. So there was great wealth and also great poverty. So the Soviet Union was also an economic superpower because its industry grew rapidly in the 1920s and 30s. Its standard of living was lower than that of the United States, but its unemployment and extreme poverty was actually very rare. Unemployment and extreme poverty was actually very rare. Whilst it was common in the US, extreme great poverty was very common. However, the standard of living in the Soviet Union was generally much lower. In the US, being free of control from the government was more important than everyone being equal. So we need to ensure the government doesn't have too much power over the people. However, in the USSR, the rights of individuals were viewed as less important than the good of society as a whole. So thus, lives were tightly controlled. The US wants other countries to follow capitalism, privately owned business and property. The USSR believed other countries should follow communism, so state-owned industry, state-owned business and property. So the USA saw its actions as just doing the right thing, whilst the USSR saw the USA's actions as selfishly building its economic empire and influence. So the US was alarmed with communist theory, which talked of spreading revolution. By contrast, the communism theory, in the USSR's view, the communism theory encouraged worldwide revolutions, since leaders were generally more practical. Alright, let's take a look at some of the American presidents. So the 32nd president was Franklin D. Roosevelt from 1933 to 1945. I've done him in blue, so he's a Democrat. Also a Democrat, we have Harry Truman, who took office in 1945 and left 8 years later in 1953. Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican, and he took office 1953 and left 8 years later in 1961. John F. Kennedy took office in 1961 and unfortunately was assassinated in 1963. Lyndon Johnson took office after Kennedy in 1963 and left 6 years later in 1969. Nixon took office in 1969 and resigned before he was impeached in 1974, 5 years later. Gerald Ford took office after Nixon for 3 years from 1974 to 1977. Jimmy Carter lasted 4 years. He took office after Gerald Ford in 1977 and left in 1981. Reagan took office in 1981 after Jimmy Carter and lasted 8 years until 1989. George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father, took office in 1989 and lasted 4 years until 1993. To compare, let's take a look at the Soviet leaders. And the Soviet Union wasn't officially established until 1922. But nonetheless, we have Lenin, who took office at the Communist Revolution in 1917, and he died 7 years later in 1924. We have Stalin, who reigned for 29 years from 1924 to 1953. We have Nikita Khrushchev, who picked up after Stalin in 1953 and lasted 11 years until 1964. Leonid Brezhnev took place after Khrushchev in 1964 and lasted 18 years until 1982. Yuri Andropov picked up after Brezhnev in 1982. He only lasted 2 years until 1984. Konstantin Chernenko picked up after Andropov and only lasted 1 year, from 1984 to 1985. And Mikhail Gorbachev was the last of the 7 Soviet leaders who took office in 1985 until the disestablishment of the Soviet Union, the dissolvement, the disbandment, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, 6 years after he took power. So on June 22nd, 1941, when the Nazi-Soviet pact was broken and then Germany actually invaded the USSR and the other allies had a common enemy. They had the common enemy of Hitler. They had the common enemy of Germany. They joined together. They united. And after the defeat of Germany, the Victory in Europe Day on the 8th of May 1945, they really had no common enemy anymore. So there was no need for them to work together. They had opposing ideologies, as we've seen. So the USSR and the Allies really began to split apart after the defeat of Germany, after they no longer had any common enemy. So let's take a look at some of the agreements and disagreements faced between the USSR and the United States, or the Allies, during World War II. So we have the Arctic convoys. This is when the Allies actually sent supplies to help the USSR via the Arctic Ocean to ensure that the USSR was not defeated by Germany. So the Allies are helping the USSR. So this was an agreement. This was an unequivocal agreement. We also have the Lend-Lease. So this is where the United States, lent, leased, and sold equipment to those countries fighting the Axis. Those countries fighting Germany, Italy, and Japan. So this was another agreement. So the invasion of France. The Allies delayed the invasion of France until the 6th of June 1944. So the USSR believed they were doing all the fighting against and taking all the casualties from Germany on the second front. So there were 27 million USSR casualties. So the USSR wasn't really happy that the Allies took so long to invade France, so this was a disagreement. They suffered many casualties, and they weren't happy about this delayed invasion, so this was a disagreement. So we also have Enigma. So the UK and the US, Britain and the United States, wouldn't pass any intelligence gathered by the UK codebreakers at Bletchley Park forward to the USSR, so none of the intelligence gained by Enigma would be passed to the USSR. They didn't want that information to become too well known. They wanted it to stay quiet, that the Germans' code had been cracked. So yeah, these code breakers broke the German encrypted signals. They didn't pass it to the USSR because they wanted to keep it quiet. They didn't want to spread the idea that their code had been cracked. And so this was obvious disagreement. The Soviets weren't happy that they weren't being passed on information, so this was a disagreement. So if we look at Poland during World War II, we have the London Poles, who were the Poles loyal to the original non-communist government that fled after Germany invaded it. They fled to London in 1939. So these London Poles, the original Polish followers, they organized the Warsaw Rising against the Germans in Warsaw. And we also have the Lublin Poles, who were the communist Polish government established by Stalin in 1944. So since we have conflicting poles, this results in a disagreement. We have some people who are loyal to the original non-communist government, and we have some people loyal to the communist Polish government created by Stalin in 1944. So there's a conflict right here. So the Warsaw Rising took place in August 1944, and it's just the London Poles who tried to attack the Germans who were occupying Warsaw at the time. And the Soviet forces were nearby but did nothing to help the London Poles. The Soviet forces nearby did nothing to help the London Poles actually attack the Germans. So the Germans actually crushed the Rising, killing 300,000 Poles. And the US and the UK, the United States and Britain, obviously complained that the Soviets, the USSR, should really have intervened. They shouldn't have let the London Poles be massacred like this. They should have intervened and helped to take over the Germans who were occupying Warsaw. They should have intervened. So this was an obvious disagreement. Now, the Katyn massacre is basically the Germans trying to break up the alliance between the Allies and the USSR. Since the USSR had actually massacred 15,000 Polish officers during the Soviet occupation of Poland in 1940 after the Nazi-Soviet pact. So this was basically the Katyn massacre. The Germans uncovered these bodies and they said, hey, these guys have, the USSR has murdered 15,000 Polish officers. So why are you allied with the USSR? It was an attempt by Germany to convince the Allies that the USSR couldn't be trusted and break up the alliance. But these were ignored. These claims were ignored by the Allies. They didn't break up the alliance, but it was still a disagreement nonetheless. The Allies weren't really happy that the Soviets had killed 15,000 Polish officers. Let's look at some key events from 1944 to 1945. So on the 6th of June 1944, we have the second front being opened. This is called D-Day, or Operation Overload. This was when the Allies invaded the Nazi-occupied France, finally. In August 1944, the next month, we have the Warsaw Rising, where the London Poles try to stand up to the German forces in France, but the USSR doesn't help in any way. The Soviet forces don't help in any way, and the rising is put down because the London Poles are heavily crushed by the Germans. In February 1945, we have the Yalta Conference, which was Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt agreeing what to do with Germany, basically. We'll go into detail in that. A couple months after the Yalta Conference, we have Franklin D. Roosevelt's death on the 12th of April. 18 days later, on the 30th of April 1945, we have Hitler's suicide. Pretty much a week after Hitler's suicide, we have Victory in Europe Day on the 8th of May 1945. In July 1945, the US tests their first atomic bomb, and also in July 1945, we have the Potsdam Conference. Which was, Potsdam's obviously a town in Germany, Yalta's obviously a town in the USSR, in Crimea. Also in July 1945, we have Winston Churchill. Replaced by Clement Attlee. He is replaced by the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. He's outvoted by Attlee. All this time has passed and Japan still hasn't surrendered, so the United States just drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima in Japan. And some people argue that it did this to try and intimidate the Soviet Union in the early stages of the Cold War. But it really just wanted to end the war fast so that no more lives were unnecessarily lost. So it drops a bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. And on the 8th of August 1945, the USSR, the Soviets, enter war against Japan. You can see this was 3 months after Victory in Europe Day. May, June, July, August. June, July, August. This was 3 months. 3 months after the Victory in Europe Day, and the Soviets promised that as soon as there was victory in Europe, 3 months later, at least 3 months later, it would enter the war against Japan. So it did this 3 months later, in the 8th of August, 1945. The US wants to end this, and the next day it drops another atomic bomb on Nagasaki. But Japan doesn't end up surrendering until around a week later, and then 15th of August 1945, where we finally have Victory in Japan Day. Victory in Japan Day. Let's take a look at the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference, this was held in February 1945. February 1945. And it was held in Yalta, hence the name Yalta Conference. And Yalta is in Crimea. And present was Churchill, with the UK Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. We also have Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt. As we know, he died not long after. And then we also have Stalin. So Roosevelt's obviously the US, Churchill is UK, and Stalin was the leader of the USSR. So what was agreed? What were the agreements at Yalta? The first agreement was the division of Berlin, Germany, and Austria into different zones of occupation, and these zones of occupation would be occupied by the USSR, the US, the UK, and France. Over here we can see those zones of occupation. We can see the UK occupies this northwest area, France occupies this southwest area, the US occupies this east, sort of southeast area, and the USSR occupies Berlin and this northeast area. And Berlin itself right here, Berlin is actually split up itself in a similar way, where we have the UK, France, and US in this kind of counterclockwise direction. So it goes UK, France, US, and USSR. And Berlin itself is split up just like this. It's split up into 4 zones. The second agreement at Yalta was free elections in Eastern Europe as soon as possible. These never actually ended up happening, but this was one of the agreements. Now, the third agreement was that the USSR would join the war against Japan. Join the war against Japan. So help the Allies fight Japan within 3 months of victory in Europe. And we know the USSR does actually fulfill this obligation, because it does join the war against Japan. Remember, we're not at the end of World War II yet. We're still fighting against Japan. Although Europe is, it looks like Germany is just about to lose, we are still fighting World War II, and it doesn't technically end until September the 2nd, where the documents are actually signed. But the USSR is to join the war against Japan within 3 months of victory in Europe, and it does fulfill this. Because we have victory in Europe on the 8th of May, and 3 months later, on the 8th of August, the USSR joins the war against Japan. And in return for joining the war against Japan, the USSR was to gain islands in the north of Japan. USSR was to gain islands to the north of Japan. So that was the reward for doing so. We also have the West to return Soviet prisoners of war back to the USSR. So, for instance, the West now occupied many parts of Germany, and obviously there were many Soviets here who the Germans had captured and who had captured during war, and the West just was supposed to return these prisoners of war that the Germans had captured back to the Soviets, which was fair enough. So return the Soviet prisoners of war back to the USSR. We also have the West agreeing to the movement of the USSR and Poland's borders to the west at the expense of Germany. So Stalin wanted to expand the Soviet Union westwards, and in order to expand the Soviets westward, in order to expand the USSR westward, we'd have to take Poland westward. Poland would also have to go westward, which meant Germany over here, Germany's land would actually decrease, because there's a block right here. So Poland's going to go west, the USSR is going to go west, but Germany is not going to go west, it's just going to stay where it is. So Germany is going to lose land at the expense of Poland and the USSR. Now Germany's going to lose land. The USSR and Poland's borders go to the west at the expense of Germany. Stalin also allowed some London Poles, so Poles loyal to London, the original regime, the original democratic non-communist regime, to join his Lublin-based communist government of Poland. So he wasn't oppressing them, he was allowing them to join. We also have the establishment of the United Nations, which is the successor of the League of Nations. And this is established, and the Security Council was to include the victors, so the USSR, the US, the UK, and France, all with the power of a veto. Now let's look at some of the issues that occurred with the February 1945 Yalta Conference. Firstly, the democratic elections never occurred in Eastern Europe that were promised by Yalta. It also raised false expectations in the West about the USSR as a reliable and trustworthy country or nation. So the argument here is that you can't actually trust them. They're just trying to spread their ideology. Now, number 3, the future of Poland caused tension between the UK and the USSR. Why did it cause tension? So on one hand, we had the USSR, who wanted Poland as a communist nation purely for protection, so to act as a buffer zone against nations who might try to invade. They'd been invaded in the past in 1914 and 1941. They don't want to be invaded again. So the USSR wants Poland as a communist nation for its own protection. On the other hand, we had the UK, who fought for its independence. It fought for Poland's independence, so it wants it as a capitalist nation, not a communist nation. So clearly we have Yalta in February 1945 and Potsdam a few months later, around 5 months later, in July 1945. But what happened between these two conferences? So in April 1945, as we've seen, Roosevelt died and he was replaced by Truman. And Truman was generally less lenient towards Stalin than Roosevelt was, and there was a clash between Truman and Molotov. Molotov was the USSR. Molotov was the USSR Minister of Foreign Affairs, and there was a clash between Molotov and Truman over the USSR implementing the agreements made at Yalta, especially over Poland. So there was tension between Truman and Molotov over Poland, the future of Poland, agreements made at Yalta regarding Poland. On the 8th of May, we have Victory in Europe Day, as we've seen. So now the USSR is occupying all of Eastern Europe, including Eastern Germany. And as we know, in July 1945, the same month as the Potsdam Conference, we have the Manhattan Project. This is the US testing its first atomic bomb. Now let's take a look at the Potsdam Conference. Potsdam is obviously a city in Germany, and it's the largest city in Brandenburg, which is a state in Germany. But this was held in July 1945. So around 5 months after the Yalta Conference. And present, we have Stalin. Once again, Stalin hasn't changed. But we do have the UK and the US changing. So for the UK, instead of Churchill was actually voted out, and we now have Clement Attlee for the UK. We now have Attlee, and that should be 2 T's. And instead of Roosevelt, for the US, we now have Truman. Roosevelt died. We now have Truman for the US. So instead of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, we now have Attlee, Truman, and Stalin for the Potsdam Conference. Let's take a look at some of the agreements that were made. So first we have German reparations. They're not quite as severe as the Treaty of Versailles, but of course Germany had to pay reparations. They were the ones who started the war once again, and these reparations were agreed, and each country was to take their reparations from their own zones of occupations, as we've seen, that were agreed at Yalta. And the USSR, since they'd done the bulk of the fighting on the Eastern Front, they were to receive additional reparations from their zones of occupation in Eastern Germany. Now, it was agreed that the Polish border would be shifted west, as would the USSR's, and the German-Polish border was agreed to be on the Oder-Neisse line. And Oder and Neisse are just a couple of rivers, but this basically finalizes the German-Polish border. The Polish border was shifted left and Germany lost land, and this border was on the Oder-Neisse line, again, 2 rivers. Now, we also have the precise borders of the various zones of occupation were agreed. So I assume these were the zones of occupation in Germany. We also have a rather important one, the denazification of Germany. So get rid of any Nazis that are left in Germany. Well, just get rid of that ideology, basically. And the establishment of the Nuremberg war trials, and this is basically to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, such as Goering. He was one of the members of the Nuremberg war trials. So Goering was actually going to be hanged, but he ended up using a cyanide consuming a cyanide capsule. He committed suicide the night before he was going to be hanged. Number 5, we have Germany to be governed by an Allied Control Council in Berlin, where each decision made required a unanimous verdict, and the country would be treated. So Germany would be treated as a single economic unit. We also have German-speaking people in Eastern Europe to be forcibly moved back to Germany, and this is known as ethnic cleansing, the idea of kicking certain people out to make your country more ethnically clean. So this is one of the other terms. So these German-speaking people in Eastern Europe were forcibly moved back to Germany. Let's take a look at some of the issues with the July 1945 Potsdam Conference. So firstly, the USSR wanted a role in the occupation of Japan, which it didn't get. There were arguments at Potsdam about the future of Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, whether it would become a communist as Stalin wanted or capitalist as the UK and the US wanted. For instance, some of these clashes were the principle of free elections at Yalta needed to be implemented. That's what the Allies wanted, but the USSR still didn't want these free elections to be implemented. And we also had the clash of the legitimacy of the London and Lublin Poles. Which one was the proper government? Should we have the London Poles, who were run the original establishment, or should we have the Lublin Poles, the new Stalin communist set-up organization? With the USSR wanting a role in the war, which it didn't get. So we have Stalin, who wanted Germany to remain economically weak and to be split up. However, at Potsdam, we see that it was treated as a single unit, and so it wasn't split up. The intention wasn't to keep it weak. The intention was to keep it prosperous. By the Allies agreed at Potsdam. And there seemed to also be disagreements about how reparations would be split up at the Potsdam Conference, but as we've seen, the USSR received additional reparations, as it did the bulk of the fighting. Here's a question. Why did tension between the US and USSR increase in 1945? This increase in tension basically led to the Cold War. Why did the relations between the US and USSR start to increase in the first place? Firstly, it's because both nations were deprived of a common enemy. Hitler was defeated. There was no common enemy for them to have, so there was no reason for them to really work together anymore. They had opposing ideologies. We'll come to that. So we have no more empires after World War II. There were far less superpowers after World War II. And so the US and the USSR were the biggest superpowers left. So their opposing views became more apparent. It was more obvious, their opposing views, since the US and USSR were really the only superpowers left after the Second World War. Another reason tension increased is because the US now had a nuclear monopoly from 1945, the Manhattan Project, to 1949 when the USSR tested their own bomb. We also have the disagreements over Poland, the tension over Poland and Eastern Europe in the Potsdam and Yalta conferences. Obviously over Poland, the UK wanted it to be capitalist, Stalin wanted it to be communist to act as a buffer zone, and so did he want Eastern Europe to act as a buffer zone. But the UK and the US and the other allies wanted these countries to be free, democratic nations. So there was disagreements over these particular areas between the US and USSR. We also have the idea of a bipolar world that, there's only really two superpowers left. We also have capitalism versus communism. As we've seen, they're opposing ideologies. Capitalism is where everything is privately owned, business and firms are privately owned, and communism is where the state owns businesses and firms. We also have the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945, and this leads to Truman coming in, and many people argue that Truman was less tolerant of Stalin, so this caused some tension between the US and USSR. Let's take a look at further development of the Cold War between 1945 and 1949. In 1946, we have Kennan's Long Telegram. And we'll go into more detail with Kennan's Long Telegram later. But Kennan's Long Telegram basically highlighted, it was basically by George Kennan. He was an American diplomat, George Kennan, and he sent an 8,000-word telegram to the Secretary of State in the United States saying that the relations between the Soviet Union need to be harsh. You need harsh policy to stop them. You need to use military force. You can't just use soft relations. You need to be strong against them. We'll go into more detail into that later. But also in 1946, we have Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. Churchill obviously isn't the Prime Minister of the UK anymore, but he's making the point that the West and East are being divided. We'll go into more detail into that later. 1947, we have the Truman Doctrine. The US promising aid to any countries, whether it's equipment, financial, aid to any countries which felt threatened by the Soviet Union. Also in 1947, we have the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is just US aid to Western Europe to try and rebuild Europe, to help it prosper, and also to help it stop it from falling to communism. We'll go into more detail. In 1947, we have Cominform created, or the Communist Information Bureau, an organization set up by Stalin to spy on the satellite states, the Eastern European states, ensure that they remained loyal to him. We'll go into further detail into that later. It's not to be confused with Comecon, which is the economic mutual assistance to ensure that all the Cominform members, all the satellite states, trade with each other and nobody else. 1948 with the Czech coup. Also in 1948 with the start of the Berlin blockade. 1949 gives us the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Also in 1949 with the end of the Berlin blockade. In 1949, we have the official division of Germany into East and West, and the east side was GDR, or the DDR, Deutsche Democratic Republic, or German Democratic Republic, and the west was the Federal German Republic. Mind you, that should be FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany. 1949, with the creation of Comecon. This basically means the Eastern Bloc, the satellite states, have to trade with each other. And in 1949, we have the first Soviet atomic test, ending the US monopoly of atomic weapons formed after the Manhattan Project in July 1945. So in 1949, we have the first Soviet atomic test. So let's take a look at some of the events of 1946. So in February 1946, we have Kennan's Long Telegram. So George Kennan was an American diplomat in Moscow, clearly studying what the USSR was doing, what was going on. And he believed Russian hostility towards the West had its origins in Russian history pre-1917, so before the Bolshevik Revolution, before Russia became communist. And he suggested that the way to deal with the USSR is through a policy of containment. He believed that eventually the USSR will collapse. And he believed that no Soviet government would attempt to make peaceful settlement with the United States. So we needed strict and harsh diplomacy, no soft rubbish. We need to be firm against the Soviet Union in terms of our foreign policy. I want to go into some depth here. I'm not going to write everything down because it would take too long. But what did Kennan's Long Telegram say? Well, it said that Russia was hostile, but the reasons for hostility arose out of the Russian government's long-term feeling of insecurity, which went back for hundreds of years and included a fear of its own people and what might happen if they found out about the outside world. Communist ideology did not create this insecurity, but it fitted it very well as Marxism teaches that conflicts in society cannot be solved peacefully. This helped the Russian government to justify the kind of relentless hostility to the outside world which they had always felt anyway. The effect of this insecurity was that no Russian government would try to make a peaceful settlement with the US, and therefore that attempts such as those made under Roosevelt and afterwards to bring the USSR into a long-term partnership were futile. The way to defeat the Soviets was by a policy of containment, because although the USSR would try to fill any space they could, they wouldn't push if they found immovable resistance. In other words, the bad news was that the USSR would never stop trying to take over the world. The good news was that they weren't in any position, they weren't in any hurry, and could be stopped at any one point of pressure. However, contrary to what Soviet leaders believed, Kennan said their rule would collapse one day with an internal struggle for control, which would transform the USSR overnight from one of the strongest to one of the weakest and most pitiable of national societies. Therefore, the US only had to contain the Soviet Union when and where it was aggressive, and wait for the Soviet Union to eventually collapse. So that was from Kennan and his 8,000-word telegram stating that we needed a policy of containment and that the USSR would eventually collapse. The next month, in March 1946, we have Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. So Churchill is no longer the Prime Minister of the UK. He was voted out, but he still is one of the famous politicians who was famous for helping the British succeed in World War II. So he's still important, and he made an Iron Curtain speech, which we'll go into. So this speech was made at Fulton, Missouri in the US. This was Truman's home state, and Truman was in attendance of the speech. And he speaks about this mythical division of Europe into two halves. He talked about how it was the separation of democratic, capitalist, and communist nations, and that the border needed to be guarded. He talked about how the USSR, the Soviets, dominated all of the Eastern European countries. He talked about how this Iron Curtain acted as a border between the Western Bloc, and the USSR-controlled countries, the satellite states, the Eastern Bloc. As we've seen before, it ran from the Baltic to the Adriatic Sea, or from Stettin to Trieste. And the USSR response to the Iron Curtain speech was the creation of Cominform, the Communist Intelligence Bureau, basically keeping an eye on all the satellite states, all the Eastern Bloc countries, Cominform. We'll go into more detail into that. Let's look at the US policy of containment from 1947 to 1991, the start of the Truman Doctrine, to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some people call this the actual dates of the Cold War. Now, the main idea of containment is to prevent expansion of the USSR outside of areas it already controls. So it's quite a simple definition. Now, this was the main policy of the United States between 1947 and 1991. And the policy of containment begins with the Truman Doctrine. The US promising to give support to countries who felt threatened by the Soviet Union, and the Marshall Plan giving Europe money to rebuild itself so it wouldn't fall to communism. This is the start of the policy of containment, and both of these events occurred in 1947. Containment can be seen in the Korean War, where the US tried to stop the spread of communism throughout Korea between 1950 and 1953, and also in the Vietnam War, where they tried to stop Vietnam from becoming communist, but they failed, and this was between 1955 and 1975. Here's a question. How did the USSR manage to gain control of the whole of Eastern Europe? How did it manage to do this? And when we're talking about Eastern Europe, we're talking about Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Poland. So these are the Eastern European countries we're concerned about. And these Eastern European countries are also known as the satellite states, or the Eastern Bloc collectively. Now, the first reason they managed to gain control of Eastern Europe is because of the presence of the Red Army after defeating the Nazis in World War II. Obviously, the USSR had to invade from the east. They invaded, they got to Germany, and after World War II, many Soviet soldiers were left in Eastern Europe, so this is one of the reasons they managed to gain control. The second reason they managed to gain control of Eastern Europe is because of the 1947 Cominform organization which Stalin established, and this is the Communist Information Bureau. So Cominform basically ran meetings and sent out instructions to satellite governments about what Stalin wanted them to do. So it sent out instructions to the Eastern Bloc governments about what Stalin wanted them to do. In 1949, we have the development of the Comecon organization by Stalin, and this is a Council of Mutual Economic Assistance. Now, Comecon Comecon basically meant that the members of the Comecon, or the satellite states, generally traded with each other rather than trading with the West. So this would ensure their own prosperity. We also have the elections. There's an argument that communism was popular, hence the USSR gained control of Eastern Europe. For example, communist coalitions in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia actually managed to win the elections. They also managed to gain control of Eastern Europe by a coup, or by seizing power by force, and they did this with Czechoslovakia in 1948. And by the way, these coalitions were in 1945. These elections were in 1945, and they seized power by force in Czechoslovakia in 1948. They also gained control of Eastern Europe by killing or threatening opponents. They imprisoned opposition, politicians, and church leaders who dissented from communism in Hungary. They did this in Hungary. So they killed and threatened opposition. They also have control of Eastern Germany from Yalta in February 1945. They were given Eastern Germany, which made it easier for them to capture the rest of Eastern Europe. And this was legal. They were allowed to have this part. It was given to them. It was a wartime agreement at Yalta. Finally, the final reason they were able to gain control of Eastern Europe is because the communists enforced a one-party state, which meant there was no opposition allowed, no opposing political parties. It was a one-party state. For instance, they did this to Czechoslovakia in 1948. They banned other parties. It was a one-party state. Only the Communist Party was allowed in these Eastern European countries. So now we know how the USSR managed to gain control of Eastern Europe. But here's another question. Why did the USSR gain control of Eastern Europe? What was the point of gaining control of all of these nations for Stalin? One argument was that somewhat tenuous, but that it was to liberate Eastern Europe from Nazi rule. The second point was that the war was a triumph for the Soviet Union and Soviet communism. Soviets had made the greatest contributions to the defeat of the Nazis, so they wanted territory as a reward. So they wanted to gain control of more of Eastern Europe as a reward. Another reason is because of the level of wartime sacrifice. The USSR made immense sacrifices during World War II. Around 20 million or so, 27 million soldiers died. Casualties. Stalin didn't want to be invaded again like it did in 1914 and in 1941. So by gaining control of Eastern Europe, this Eastern Bloc would act as a buffer zone against attack, against another invasion. We also have the USSR wanting to gain control of Europe because of the Soviet strategic thinking. Stalin would not allow anti-Soviet governments to border the USSR. So it didn't want anti-Soviet governments in Eastern Europe because that would just threaten the USSR. We also have the idea of US imperialism. There was a fear that the US would dominate Eastern Europe if the USSR did not. Another reason was to gain economic resources to rebuild the USSR. And by gaining control of these countries of Eastern Europe, they would be able to gain these resources. Okay, so here's a question. What was the importance of Poland? So there was a lot of contention regarding this country. Of course, the UK wanted it to be capitalist, Stalin wanted it to be communist, but what was the importance of Poland? So firstly, the first reason why it was important is because it was the largest East European nation. Secondly, second reason why it was important is because Poland was the invasion route from Germany to the USSR, and the USSR had been invaded in 1914 and in 1941, so it was the invasion route, so it wanted to secure this. The USSR wanted to ensure it wasn't invaded again. Now, expounding upon this idea, Poland was vital to the USSR because it was a major buffer zone. If the USSR managed manages to get control of Poland, then this acts as a major buffer zone which stops any form of invasion into the USSR. We also have its importance to Britain. In September 1939. The UK had invaded, it declared war on Germany because of Poland, so it was very important to the United Kingdom. Now, one thing worth noting about Poland is that it had a generally anti-Russian history. It didn't really like the Russians. First reason why was because it was controlled by the Tsarist Russia until 1917, with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where it would have been controlled by Germany, until 1920, the Treaty of Versailles, where it was actually became its own independent nation. But it was controlled by Tsarist Russia, which it didn't really like. It would rather have been independent. We also have the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, where the Nazis and the Soviets agreed to both split up Poland, which Poland didn't really like. It would rather have stayed its own country rather than being invaded and split up by Germany and the Soviet Union via the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939. We also have the Katyn Massacre in 1940, where the Soviets had killed many, many Poles, and the Germans had uncovered these bodies. But we've gone into that. So obviously the Poles didn't like that. And another reason the Poles don't really like the Russians is because in the Warsaw Rising of 1944, when the London Poles tried to rebel against the Germans who were in Warsaw, the Soviets really did nothing to help or prevent the Germans from just absolutely crushing and just obliterating the revolt. The USSR really did nothing to help the Poles liberate Warsaw in the Warsaw Rising of 1944. Taking a real quick timeline of the Cold War between 1945 and 1949, we see that in 1941, the US, UK, and USSR were allies, as they had a common enemy of Germany. And after Germany was defeated in 1945, there's really no reason for them to start working together anymore. We have Yalta and Potsdam, some agreements, and then the next year in 1946, we have the Iron Curtain speech and Kennan's Long Telegram. Kennan's Long Telegram suggests a new policy of containment toward the USSR. It suggests this policy toward the USSR. Then the next year in 1947, via the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, which kind of go hand in hand, with the official start of the US policy of containment against the USSR. The official start doesn't begin until the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan in 1947, but it's suggested by Kennan via his long telegram in 1946. So that is a brief timeline right there. Let's take a look at the Truman Doctrine, which was in March 1947. It's the arguable start of the Cold War. It's the start of the policy of containment against the USSR. So the Truman Doctrine promised American support. It promised US money, equipment, and advice to nations who were threatened by communism and threatened by the Soviet Union, by the Soviet Union's expansion. So this was the official start of the policy of containment and the political start of the Cold War, where the US and the USSR the tension really began to become apparent. Now, Truman's quote, one of Truman's quotes in March 1947 was, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free people of the world must look to us for support in maintaining those freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world." So that was from Truman. So what were some of the motives for the Truman Doctrine? What were some of the motives of the US providing money, equipment, and advice to nations who were threatened by communism? So the first motive was this fear of the spread of communism in Eastern Europe. The USSR really couldn't be trusted anymore. The US saw the Soviet expansionism. The US saw the Eastern Europe Soviet expansionism as the takeover of Eastern Europe. So basically, the US and the Allies saw the takeover of Eastern Europe as Soviet expansionism rather than the desire for security via a buffer zone. they couldn't really trust the the USSR anymore. So they feared the spread of communism in Eastern Europe. They couldn't trust them. Stalin never delivered on his free elections in Eastern Europe that he agreed to at Yalta. So there was increasing tension, and there was a fear of spread of communism in Eastern Europe in the US's eyes. Another motive to provide money, equipment, and advice to nations threatened by communism was because of the vulnerability of Italy and France to communism. There was a fear that both of Italy and France might end up electing a communist leader. They might end up electing communist governments, and there was a fear that there would be a domino effect of communism falling to communism that may occur. We also have the situation in Greece. There was a Greek civil war between the communists and the non-communists, and the UK is bankrupt after World War II. It's very poor, even though it won. And the UK could no longer economically support the non-communist Greek government, so Greece might fall to communism. Greece might become communist since the UK is bankrupt and can no longer economically support the non-communist Greek government. Providing aid, the Truman Doctrine providing aid to countries who felt threatened by the Soviet Union, was a way to stand up to communism. It was a way to use containment. It was a way to stand up to communism without actually entering a war. And this links to the 1946 Iron Curtain speech by Churchill and Kennan's Long Telegram, where it was suggested that a new policy of containment was needed. This was the beginnings. These were the foundations of that policy of standing up to communism without actually beginning a war. Another reason they used the Truman Doctrine is because the US wanted to secure Turkey from communism. The main reason they wanted to secure Turkey is to secure the Suez Canal, which was pretty close. It wasn't too far away from Turkey, the Suez Canal. So they wanted to secure that. Also the Dardanelles Strait, but the Suez Canal was far more important. It allowed the British and all those other countries to export into Asia without taking a long route. So the US wanted to secure Turkey from communism in order to secure the Suez Canal and make sure it didn't get under communist control. What was the importance of the March 1947 Truman Doctrine? So it showed the US was no longer followed its policy of isolationism. It gave $400 million to Greece and Turkey. Greece, obviously, because the UK could no longer support it. It was bankrupt. It didn't want Greece to fall to communism. And also Turkey. It didn't want Turkey to fall to communism because it wanted to secure the Suez Canal, which was nearby. So this shows it didn't want Greece or Turkey to become communist. It also shows the US would prevent the spread of communism and follow its containment ideologies suggested by Kennan in 1946. And the Truman Doctrine contributed to the Cold War. It was a political beginning of the Cold War. It was a political beginning of... It was the political beginning of containment, which was the US policy until 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's talk about the Marshall Plan. It happened 1 month after the Truman Doctrine in March 1947, so this was 1 month later, in April 1947, and the proper name was the European Recovery Program. This was the official name, and the Marshall Plan was named after George Marshall, who was the U.S. Secretary of State who proposed the idea. Now, the Marshall Plan gave $13 billion in aid to Western European countries after World War II. It was really to try and help them, to help their economies prosper so that they wouldn't fall to communism. But let's go into more detail. So most of the aid, most of this $13 billion distributed to these European countries went to UK, then France, then Germany, then Italy. So the first motive was that it was a humanitarian gesture to really help a poverty-stricken Europe that was struggling to recover from the war after World War II. There is an argument that the Marshall Plan was purely self-interest. The US was the only country that recipients of the Marshall aid could spend money in, so arguably this would just go back to help stimulate their own economy and drive demand and goods for their own economy. We also have giving aid to Europe creates an economically prosperous Europe which would not support communism. So it kind of like creates a golden age almost. If we remember from Weimar Germany, the golden age, when Germany's economy was doing relatively well, no one voted for extreme parties.
It was only after the economy collapsed that they started voting for the communists and for the Nazis, the extreme parties. But when Germany was prosperous, they would not vote for extreme parties. So if we can make Europe prosperous by pumping money into their economy, an economically prosperous Europe would not support extreme parties such as communism. This would create stability. So it kind of creates a golden age by pumping money into the European economy. It creates a golden age which will stop a rise in popularity for extreme parties. So an economically prosperous Europe would not support communism. Now, another reason why the self-interest is evident is because at the time, in 1945, the US was responsible for 50% of the world's manufacturing. It was responsible for 50% of the world's secondary sector, 50% of manufacturing. So if the recipients of Marshall Aid could only spend money in the US, this would only improve the US economy. This would only improve US manufacturing and ensure that US stays a dominant economic power. So maybe there is an element of self-interest to that, as well as humanitarian and this political motive to create an economically prosperous Europe which would not support communism, which is containment.
So a note about the Marshall Plan. Stalin rejected Marshall Aid for the USSR and the satellite states, so rejected this humanitarian gesture to help these nations who had struggled after World War II. He rejected this Marshall Aid for himself and for Europe and for the satellite states. The reason he did this is because he didn't want the Eastern Bloc, he didn't want the satellite states to really turn toward the US and capitalism, to really become friends with the US, to look towards up to the US, and because that would turn these nations away from communism. So he wanted them to stay loyal to communism. He didn't want them to turn toward the US and capitalism, so he rejected the Marshall Aid for the USSR and for these satellite states. Here's a question. Why was the US hostile toward the USSR? Now, this is different from the question of why was there increasing tension between the US and USSR after 1945, but it's asking why was the US actually hostile toward the USSR? And there are several reasons. Let's go over some of them. The first reason is because the USSR actually undertook hostile actions and broke agreements. For instance, we have the Czech coup in 1948, which was illegal, and we also have the failure to deliver on the Declaration of a Liberated Europe, and this was agreed at Yalta. The Declaration of Liberated Europe was agreed at Yalta, and this basically said, Stalin, you need to give the Eastern European nations free elections, but they never got them. So the USSR was hostile, it took over countries, and it failed to deliver on promises, and it broke agreements. We also have the idea of a bipolar world, the fact that only really two powers exist after World War II, and with the idea of capitalism, private enterprise, versus communism, state-owned enterprise, state-owned business. Now, the US had actually learned lessons from the failure of British and French appeasement in the 1930s towards Hitler. The British and French appeased Hitler, Hitler only got stronger, it didn't work. So the US had learned from this, and they realized that you need to stand up to aggression. You can't just let the USSR grow stronger and appease it. You must stand up to any form of hostility or aggression. This is why the US was hostile toward the USSR. It didn't want to make the same mistake the British and French made. As we know, the US had a nuclear monopoly from 1945 to 1949 when the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapon, and they used this to intimidate the USSR. Now it's time to look at the Berlin blockade, but before we do that, it's important to look at the plan for Germany in 1945, and we've already seen this by the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, but it's important to just get an overview, and we'll do a quick summary. So we know Germany was to be divided into four, Berlin was to be divided into four, and the USSR would take reparations from Germany. We know this from Yalta and Potsdam. We also know the Polish-German border was to be moved west to the Oder-Nasse line at the order of Stalin, who wanted to move the USSR's borders into Poland, so they had to move Poland west. Germany was to be denazified, de-armed, and democratized, and the Allied Control Council would control Germany. Let's look at the Allied divisions over Germany. So it was clear that the West wanted to help Germany. So the Americans, the British, and the French wanted to actually help Germany, but the USSR, the Soviets, were just using German resources to gain power and to rebuild its own country. In January 1948, the American and British zones actually merged. The American and British zones of Germany merged together to form a single economic unit, so they worked together economically, and this was called Bizonia. And in 1948, France joins this economic unit, and now it's called Trizonia instead of Bizonia, because now there's 3 countries. And the USSR is worried that the Allies are kind of merging together to try and prepare to fight the USSR in some way. They're kind of threatening the USSR by all uniting together, creating a clear distinction between the 2 German zones. So the USSR feared that the Allies were going to join together to kind of create an alliance against the Eastern German zone. That's what their fear was. And in March 1948, just 2 months after the American and British zones merged, the zones agreed to merge politically as well as economically. We also have the Marshall Plan, as we know, the USA agreeing to send Marshall aid to the western zones of Germany, as well as most of Western Europe. And in June 1948, we have the Western powers introducing a new currency into their zones. So a new currency is introduced. This is to kind of make their zones prosper, their own western zones prosper, their western parts of Germany prosper more than the USSR's eastern areas, creating a clear contrast between the two powers. So all of these divisions over Germany gave Stalin the impression that the US favored a permanently divided Germany linked to the West. So Stalin's response was to actually cut all the road, rail, and canal links leading to West Berlin. So now that we've got some context, we can actually talk about the Berlin blockade, which was established in June 1948 and lasted 11 months until May 1949. And we need to know some facts about the Berlin blockade. We already know it was established June 1948, and Stalin reopened the links to West Berlin in 1949, so he removed the blockades in May 1949. And Stalin wanted to stamp his authority on Berlin, because Stalin believed this would force the Allies out of Berlin, so that Berlin could become entirely dependent on the USSR. So Stalin built the Berlin blockade because he believed it would force the Allies to get out of Berlin. So the Allies are in Berlin. Imagine this is Berlin with the Allies on the west. He believed that if he puts a blockade between West Germany, I believe at the time it was called Trizonia. This is the Allies. If he put a blockade, this would force the existing Allies out of Berlin, so that the USSR could come in and make Berlin entirely dependent on the USSR. So this is why Stalin built the Berlin blockade in June 1948. So in the Berlin blockade, he cut off the land-based routes so that only air corridors were possible. So you couldn't drive through, you couldn't walk through. The only way to get to Berlin was via airplanes. So the only way to get in was to use airplanes of some form to drop off supplies. And that's what the Allies actually did. They didn't declare war on the USSR. They didn't feel like it. Instead, they just flew over and dropped off supplies. And of course, there was not much the USSR could do about this. Stalin didn't want to shoot down the planes or anything, as this would be an act of war. He wasn't interested in going into a war with the Allies at the moment. His attempt to shut them out had failed because the Allies just dropped off the supplies directly into Berlin. So we know that neither side wanted to risk war. So the Allies didn't want to break down this blockade, as this would be an act of war, and Stalin didn't want to shoot down the planes, as this would be an act of war. Truman would not give up on Berlin. He did not want to use appeasement like the Allies, like the UK and French and like the British and French did in the 1930s. He would not resort to appeasement. He would not give up on Berlin. We know the plane's supplies had to support a vast 2 million people, so this was quite an expensive project. Flying the planes over and dropping them off resulted in a lot of money expended. And the fact that it was expensive, yet the Allies still decided to do it, shows the Allies' economic might, particularly that of the United States. And as we know, Stalin gave up on the blockade and reopened it 11 months later. There was no need for it to be there. It clearly wasn't going to do anything, so he just reopened the routes. He reopened the blockade. Right, consequences of the June 1948 Berlin blockade. And the Berlin blockade led to the creation of NATO in April 1949. This was between the period when the Berlin blockade was up and when it was reopened. We know the Berlin blockade was created in June 1948 and it was reopened in May 1949. So it's significant. It's worth noting that NATO was created in between these periods. NATO was created in April. 1 month before it was closed, NATO was created in April 1949, whilst the Berlin blockade existed. So it's arguable that one of the consequences of the Berlin blockade was the creation of NATO. NATO is just the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance of 12 states: the US, UK, France, Canada, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, Portugal, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. And it was the first time in US history that it had entered into an entangling alliance during peacetime, because there was no war occurring at the moment. Although the USSR may have posed a threat, there was no actual war occurring, and the US had entered into an entangling alliance with these other European countries, whilst there is actual peace. There's no war going on, so it shows that the US has abandoned its policy of isolationism. It's actually involved in European affairs now. Now, the US was committed to the defense of Europe by pledging mutual assistance to any member state suffering aggression. So the US would help any state that felt threatened by another state, whether that be another European nation or particularly the USSR, which resembles the Truman Doctrine. So this is fundamentally, this is just like the League's idea of collective security. The idea that if one state attacks another, the other states will work against that, will work together to deter the aggressor. This is the idea of collective security, and it shows how the Europe is now reliant on US. Europe is now completely reliant on the United States. And this is because of its nuclear capability. It still has, it's because of its nuclear capability. It may have the monopoly at the time, but still have the nuclear monopoly. Yeah, so the US still had the nuclear monopoly at the time because the Soviets didn't produce their bomb until the August 1949. That's when the US nuclear monopoly ended. But at the moment, Europe is reliant on the US because of its nuclear capabilities, because of its nuclear monopoly. And NATO also led to the European realization that the defense of Europe was only viable with US intervention. So the Europeans wanted a permanent US presence in Europe to deter Soviet aggression. The Berlin blockade also led, another consequence of the Berlin blockade was the creation of FGR and GDR. FRG and GDR. FRG is a Federal Republic of Germany, that's the west side, controlled by the Allies, and on the east we have the German Democratic Republic, also known as the DDR, or the Deutschland Democratic Republic, and this is on the east, controlled by the Soviet Union. So Germany is now split into two regions. And it turns out this is actually in May 1949, to get some context. So it's around the same time as the Berlin blockade actually collapses. We have the creation of West Berlin and East Berlin, May 1949. The Berlin blockade also led to the creation of Comic-Con in January 1949. We already know what Comic-Con is, but let's quickly review it. So Comic-Con stands for the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance. It was set up by Stalin in January 1949, and it was to coordinate the industries and trade of the satellite states of the Eastern Bloc states. So the idea was that it traded with one another rather than with the West. It favored the USSR more than the other members. So its members traded with each other rather than with the West. It favors the USSR more than its other members, and it provides the USSR with a market for its goods. It guaranteed the USSR a cheap supply of raw materials such as coal from Poland, and in 1964 Comic-Con set up a bank for all the socialist countries. We also have the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, also known as IGCSE, in July 1952. This was to improve the industry and relations between France and Germany so that there was no more bitterness between the two countries. This is in the notes, but I wouldn't say it's a consequence of the German blockade. We have all these organizations. Certainly NATO was a consequence of the German blockade. There was bitterness and tension between the USSR, so they created a military alliance to ease this tension. And the creation of FRG and GDR, the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, is because of the Berlin blockade. And I'd also say the creation of Comic-Con is because of the Soviet concern about the West. But this European coal and steel community, I wouldn't say is a consequence of the German blockade, though it is in the notes. And also somewhat unrelated to the Berlin blockade. I think it's just these two guys that are unrelated. But we also have another organization, the Warsaw Pact, and this was in May 1955, and it was a defense organization for the Eastern Bloc, for the satellite states, for Stalin's states, Eastern Europe. It was a defense organization for them, and it was triggered after Germany joins NATO. After Germany joins NATO, that's what causes the Warsaw Pact to be created. Because after Germany joins NATO, the Soviets are obviously concerned about Germany's aggression. They'd been invaded in the past, 1914, 1941. They don't want to be invaded again, so they create a defense organization called the Warsaw Pact because they're afraid of what Germany might do after it joins NATO. The Warsaw Pact.